Espansiva is the title Carl Nielsen gave to his third symphony. And Espansiva, expansive, could equally well be the description of his life and his work. His music has a quality rare in the 20th century, a quality of generous optimism and humanity. He's the greatest musical figure to come out of Denmark. The first book in English on Nielsen was written by the composer Robert Simpson. What attracted him to the music?
I was so obsessed by this music, somehow it struck me as the sort of music that I knew already existed somewhere, but which I had never been able to find. And there it was, I'd found it. You know how you sometimes get this feeling about music, you get a feeling that there is a kind of music which you haven't heard and which you want to hear. That's perhaps why one composes, you know, you try to write the kind of music which you think ought to exist and you ought to hear. And sometimes somebody else has done it for you. And Nielsen was like this with me. It was a tremendous discovery.
The conductor Jascha Horenstein met and worked with Nielsen in 1927.
Well, the first impression, I would say an optimistic man. Let's see, for somebody who knew Schönberg, as I knew very well, just the diametrically opposite. You know, he was short, pleasant, always with a twinkle in his eye, very modest, completely unpretentious.
Nielsen died in 1931, but his two daughters still live near Copenhagen. They remember him both as musician and man.
I remember when he woke up in the morning, and then he went to, it was a very ordinary, I mean, we had no washstands, it was very old-fashioned. And he went to a big sort of, what we had there, bowl, and put his head in and put his hair in and made his hands up and whoosh, and he whirled them with the water and made a terrible noise. So I remember that when he woke up in the morning and his hair stood right up there, and it went up all the life long, you know, his hair standing up like that.
And the funniest thing is when you listen to his music now, you see there is a kind of many human faculties in him. When you listen to him, there's something very demonical in his music. And there's something very bright and very lovely. And if you think of his, and when he think of his birthplace in Funen, and that comes out in his music, then it is light and kind and wonderful. He loved this place, Funen.
The island of Funen was his birthplace. Its sights and sounds stayed with him all his life. In his 50s, he wrote an autobiography of his childhood there.
On the 9th of June, 1865, my mother had a bad but, I suppose, happy day. My parents lived in a little cottage in the middle of a field near a small village in the heart of Funen. My mother was alone at home with some of the smaller children when I was expected. It was a hard birth, and she went outside the cottage, took hold of a tree, and beat her head against the trunk. So I think she must have been glad and relieved when I, at length, came into the world.
Funen was the birthplace of Hans Christian Andersen as well as Nielsen. It's often called the Garden of Denmark. Its air is calm and refreshing, its countryside mild and gently undulating. It's mainly farmland, and the island is dotted with neat, brightly coloured cottages and houses. It was in this rural atmosphere that Carl Nielsen was born. His childhood was spent in this small house, just outside the village of Nørre. He was one of a large family, weighed down with the poverty and illness which were the inevitable accompaniment to a 19th century peasant childhood. His father was a house painter, as well as being the local fiddle player at dances and celebrations, and he was also something of a local character.
He was not very high. He was a little man with a rough beard. He had a grey beard and very sharp eyes under big bushy eyebrows. And, well, he used to come with some very well-thought remarks. He didn't speak so much, but when he spoke, it was a sort of a little bit of satirical. Because when he came, my father invited his friends from Funen to see him, and there was the minister, Claus Berntsen, and there were other persons. And my grandfather was very pleased, and then he could start to talk funny stories. And he was very witty and sharp, and he was a little sarcastical over life, you know. He was saying to a man who was very speaking of all what he could do on his violin and so on. So my grandfather just said to him, "Oh, what would you say if you couldn't piece, you know?" So he made that sort of remarks, you know, always.
It was from his mother that the composer began to derive a passionate love of nature and landscape.
When she had finished the heavier chores, she would sit near the bed with some patching or darning job and sing tunes for me that I had to try to find on the violin. When she sang to herself, there was a wistful note in her voice, as if she longed for something right over the farthest trees. One hot summer day, we all agreed not to work in the dinner hour, but roam about looking for fish in some nearby ponds and peat pits. But it wasn't long before we were all dozing in some scorched grass. One of my hands hung over the edge of the pit, and you could feel how the sun had warmed the crumbling soil. A distant sheep bleated for water, but it only made me drowsier, like a bit of a lullaby. All around was a humming and a rustling of sun-dry beetles and ladybirds, crawling in the burnt grass or taking flight. Some of us lay on our backs with our caps over our faces, others face down to shield ourselves from the sun. It was as though all the world were singing a fine tune that only increased in drowsiness when a bumblebee or some other big insect streaked buzzing by, or when for a moment the grasshoppers were still. We lay like wheat after the harvest, without thought, without will, enchanted by nature's strange brew of sound and smell, of sun and warmth.
Not far away from his native village was the main town on the island, Odense. The young Carl had been taught the trumpet by his father, and this led him to his first job as a musician. At the age of 14, he became a bugler and junior bandsman at these army barracks in Odense. In his time off duty, he began to educate himself. He bought a piano and took some lessons from an old pianist he met in a beer cellar. In this way, he first got to know the music of Haydn, Mozart, Bach, and Beethoven. After 4 years, he had worked hard enough to become a fair violinist and composer. He won a place at the Copenhagen Conservatoire. It was goodbye to his rural childhood.
I shall be coming back, and then I shall greet everything again, and tell Mother and Lars Cry and all my friends about Copenhagen. There's nothing the matter, and I may yet remain calm, even when Mother begins to sing one of her touching little songs as I close my bag. And so it's off. On one of the first days of January, I travelled to Copenhagen, and my youth and childhood on Funen were at an end.
It was to the Copenhagen of the 1880s that Nielsen came as a student. Soon after leaving the conservatoire, he got into the second violins of the Royal Chapel Orchestra. His early music had some success, and in 1890 he was able to go on a European tour. In Paris, he met a young Danish sculptress, Anne-Marie Brodersen, and they married almost at once. Soon after his marriage, he wrote the first of his 6 symphonies and showed it to Brahms, whom he met in Hamburg on a visit. Brahms liked it, as well he might, since it showed the influence of his style. But even stronger is the character of Nielsen himself in this early work. Indeed, it is in his symphonies that his musical character emerges most vividly. They give a wonderfully clear picture of his development. There are 2 special things to remember about this symphonic development. First, he never lost touch with his roots, and second, his outlook on life got wider and wider.
It's a complete directness and honesty coupled with total intellectual control. A great warmth, a great humanity, a generosity, a great energy, which comes from a man who looks outwards at the world rather than inwards at himself all the time. I often contrast him with Moller, for instance, who is a great figure of the other kind, the kind of figure who is really a romantic in my view, who looks looks inward all the time and thinks of himself as the centre of a gigantic stage. The whole world is his theatre, in a sense, of which he is the chief protagonist, and he tells the world of all his sufferings and miseries and so on. Nielsen is the complete opposite of that. He is the character who looks at the world in a detached and yet entirely human and sympathetic way. He seems to understand the problems of his fellow men in an objective way.
Nielsen's second symphony is called The Four Temperaments, and its second movement is a kind of reflection of the phlegmatic character. The composer's daughter, Irmelin, often used to watch her father at work.
Sometimes he could compose very quickly, and he had a little pencil in his mouth. And he sat at the piano, and he always used the piano when he composed. And he sat at the piano, and as soon as he got something, he took the little pencil out and put it there, and then again in the mouth. And then, of course, he knew then he could hear what he wanted. Sometimes it was very quickly that he got along, but sometimes he stopped. And there was some little difficulty to go from one theme to the next, because he knew in a few bars he would want to be at a certain point in the music. And after those bars, suddenly I came in one day, and they were absolutely empty, the bars. And he couldn't quite know, he didn't quite know what he was going to put there. He stopped maybe 8 bars, maybe it was 16, I don't know how many. But anyway, he knew he was going over there to the next theme. And then he could sit very quietly and try, and sometimes when he touched a note that he didn't like, it was as if he'd burned himself.
One of the things which I admire enormously about Nielsen is the fact that he is so generous in his attitude to the resources of music. Nielsen is what I call an inclusive composer. He is greatly concentrated on the basic facts of sonority. He himself said that one should take these simple intervals and find out just what is inside them. And he always took this positive attitude to everything. About the same thing with instruments. He said, I sometimes think through the instruments as if I had crept inside them. And everything is positive. Everything is connected with the nature of the instruments, the nature of the sounds, the nature of the human voice. And the construction of his symphonies is entirely positive. And he is an inclusive, and therefore, to me, a genuinely symphonic composer.
The Fifth Symphony was finished in 1922 and formed a climax in Nielsen's creative life.
The Fifth Symphony is one of the most original constructions that Nielsen or anyone else ever made, I think. It comes from his sense of what's called progressive tonality, the idea of starting in one key and ending in another, so that the process between shall be completely organic, and that one feels at the end that he has arrived at it in a completely satisfying way. I hesitate to use the word logical, because logic and music I don't think have much to do with each other. But in the Fifth Symphony, for instance, the first movement is constructed on 3 great planes of tonality. It starts in F, which is a kind of key always in that symphony associated with inertia, a feeling of of going nowhere.
Let's take a guided tour through the first movement of the symphony with Robert Simpson.
We can see that the violas begin with a soft, neutral tremolo figure. It's like the passing of time, or perhaps like one of those waves on an oscillograph. Shapes begin to form, dimly at first. There's a sudden harsh sound from the bassoons. And the viola line momentarily reacts. Then it settles down again to its neutral uniformity. Imagine you were born blind and later suddenly received sight. At first, it would be hard to identify anything. Things that were quite harmless might seem frightening. But as you gained confidence, you'd come up against more real and serious problems, those of life itself. Every time there's a disturbance, the violas react to it, like an earthquake warning. The violins float in with a large, calm melody, derived from the up and down viola motion, and the basses indicate the key of F. Nielsen's deliberately associating this key with an air of mystified inertia. It's a region the music has got to get out of somehow. Into this atmosphere comes a sinister element, an all too plain side drum rhythm, mechanical and dismaying. The two notes of the original viola part now tramp heavily, like the tick of some monstrous clock. The violins try to maintain a line, but it's constantly disrupted, and the woodwind give vent to wild cries. Nevertheless, the key of F is disappearing, and the music is managing to pull itself up a fifth to C. We hear the cellos hit hard on C, and for the moment the music calms down and the side drum is silent. Now the bass tries to rise still further. It's got from F to C. Perhaps it can get up still another fifth, to G. It gets as far as G flat, not quite far enough, and collapses again back to C. For the discouraging side drummers come in again. The music subsides into ominous mystery, with a strange contradiction of harmonies utterly opposed to each other. And the note D is heard softly and insistently repeated through the haze. A seemingly meaningless signal, yet it's a light of some sort. Suddenly, this D is explained by a radiant G major. The key the bassist tried so desperately to reach, and at last the music is free. Great lines extend themselves into mighty arches of light, one of the most inspired passages in Nielsen. Now comes the crunch. Abruptly and violently, the side drum attacks this majestic music, and a tremendous battle follows, during which the drummer is instructed to improvise as if at all costs to destroy the music. The climax that results is one of the most awesome in 20th century music. At length, the side drum is swallowed up, and the whole thing dies away into a marvelous hush, with touching clarinet cadenzas, and the drum disappearing into the far distance, for all the world like a deserted battlefield.
In the early 1920s, Nielsen began to suffer from ill health, to get heart attacks. It was a bitter blow to a man of his nature, and he hid the fact from everyone except his family.
My heart has been quite unruly and hurting me, but for the moment I'm keeping quiet. My sixth symphony is entirely idyllic in character, in other words, far removed from the taste and fashion of the day. Just idyllic and passionate.
Well, he tried in this sixth symphony, but serious, problematic things keep breaking in. There's a poignant struggle in the music to regain the innocence of the original intention. In the first movement, the climax comes in a terrible upheaval, which is fearsomely suggestive of more than mental stress. It's like a physical heart attack. the work of a man aware of imminent death. Nielsen's illness coincided with his increasing frustration at his lack of international success.
If I were to live my life again, I would chase all artistic notions out of my head and go into business. The more trouble you take, the worse your practical situation becomes. But what's the use of having the whole world raising its hat to me if it hurries on and leaves me sitting alone with my wares till everything collapses?
No, he wasn't depressed. You can't say he was a depressed man. Nevertheless, he was a little depressed the very last time he came out to my little country house. He was depressed and said he might have done something that was futile and that nobody would care for, so on. But it's a pity that he doesn't know now how it came around. I tried to persuade him and tell him that I believed at that time, but I couldn't persuade him.
Nielsen is somehow also the victim of being a member of a minority group. You know how tragic it is if a great composer or a great writer or a great philosopher does not belong to a country like England or France or Germany or Russia, but take another national of Nielsen. Are you aware that only in 1947 the first Kierkegaard English translation was published by the Princeton University Press? So late. I mean, imagine if Kierkegaard were a German philosopher or a French or an English. Certainly not 120 years. It wouldn't last 120 years till a translation into another language.
He had the misfortune to live in the shadow of another, very different Scandinavian symphonist, Sibelius. The Finnish composer won international recognition, and yet this was something which eluded Nielsen in his own lifetime. However, the picture was not all black, and only the Sixth Symphony really shows signs of a breaking spirit. In the last years, he wrote music of great lyrical beauty and serenity, like the flute concerto and the piano music for young and old. Simple pieces, but absolutely characteristic of the best in Nielsen. Nielsen was a man always turned out towards the world, and his humanity saved him from total despair.
Those very temperamental and those very hard and those very, very disheartening things that comes out in his later works, you didn't feel when you were with him. He was not that kind. He didn't show the very deepest things in himself. Never. But of course, we could feel that there was something much more, and we could hear it when we heard his music. That was absolutely one of the sides of him that was hidden down in himself, very much down in himself.
Carl Nielsen once wrote an essay in which he made music speak for itself.
I am everywhere and nowhere. I leap over the wave and over the top of the forest. I sit in the throat of the savage, on the foot of the Negro, and sleep in stone and ringing ore. None can catch me, all can grasp me. I live 10 times more intensely than anything alive, and die 10 times deeper. I love the great plain of silence, and it's my greatest joy to invade it. I know nothing of sorrow and jubilation, gaiety and weeping, but I can rejoice, cry, laugh, and lament at the same time, and eternally.